Hello everyone, thank you for being here today. Today I'll be talking about the Islamic influence on art and architecture of the Mediterranean, with a particular focus on Sicily and Venice. This lecture will be separated into two sections. The first will focus on Sicily from the 9th to the 12th centuries, and then later during the 17th and 18th centuries. On one end, Sicily represents an island that experienced an Islamic dynastic rule and thus an impact on the governmental structure, religious life, and economic ties. In the second part, we'll transition to Venice during the Renaissance, so around the 15th and 16th centuries. Venice, conversely, remained an independent city-state that had an extensive trade relationship with the Islamic world that went into North Africa, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. Here, in this part, we'll examine the impact that Venice's extensive trade relationships with the Islamic world had on the formation of a unique visual culture in Venice. Nonetheless, these two distinct moments are exemplary of the intertwined relationships that the Islamic world had with the larger Mediterranean world, and ultimately, how it's a vital part of the Mediterranean history and culture. This lecture aims to exemplify the Mediterranean as an intimate network of economic and political histories that complicate the traditional binary of Islamic versus Christian world or Eastern versus Western. A quick note on terminology. I'll use the term Islamic world, Islamic art, the Islamic caliphate, mostly in reference to the influence that Islam had on the region, visual representation, or governmental structure. Non-Muslims, particularly Christians and Jews, were intimately involved in the production and trade of such objects deemed Islamic, or influenced by Islamic design. Furthermore, Islam was not the only religion being practiced in the Middle East and North African region throughout the aforementioned centuries. However, Islam had a profound impact on societal structures and serves as a constant throughout the Arab, Turkish, and Persian cultures that had extensive contact with the greater Mediterranean world. So it's precisely demonstrations of this contact that we'll look at today. So let's first start with Sicily. A little bit of historical context. We'll start there. So how did Muslims get to the island that is today a part of Europe? Well, it's actually not too difficult, considering that parts of Sicily are actually further south than parts of Tunisia. And in fact, the dynasty from Tunisia that was the one that made its way across the sea. So we can see here, right here is modern-day Tunisia, and Sicily, the island that we'll be looking at today. Beginning in the mid-9th century, the Aghlabid dynasty from Tunisia conquered Sicily from the Byzantine Empire. The Aghlabid dynasty was operating under the Abbasid Caliphate, which at the time was headquartered in Baghdad. The Val di Mazara was the first stronghold of the Tunisian dynasty when they came across. So today, the Val di Mazara is in the western part of the island, and the name actually derives from the Arabic word, or words, walayat mashallah, which means the state, the godly state, we can say. And anyway, it was the first stronghold of the Aghlabids, and after about 5 years, they pushed their way towards the capital city of the island, called Palermo, which is today the largest city on the island. As the capital of the Emirate of Sicily, so Palermo, it was the capital for about 250 years. So between 831 to 1072 AD. Palermo was the source of several fundamental agricultural, maritime, political, and therefore economic revolutions, thanks to the dynasty's inheritance of advancements from the Middle East. Today, Palermo is the largest city on the island still, and the center for much of the architectural and engineering innovations that we'll be looking at today. So Sicily integrated well into the Abbasids Caliphate's already extensive maritime trade networks, which extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Sea up to the Caspian Sea. The emirate first began, so here's another photo of Sicily. So the emirate, when they first came into the island, they began an agrarian reform. So a few things, dividing large estates, establishing property boundaries, instituting a widespread irrigation system, tax networks, and also establishing subterranean waterways to bring water throughout the city that was coming in from the more rural areas. So not only were they working on developing the rural areas in terms of land reforms, but then also bringing that organization into the city. One thing that we can see from this today is the qanat, or channels, that come from the Arabic word qana, qanawat, that are still in the city today, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So a few things in terms of agriculture that they developed. They introduced the cultivation of artichokes, oranges, lemons, pistachios. I have a few more up there. New crops that they introduced, and for example, today, some of them are still major exports. So new crops: almonds, artichokes, apricots, cinnamon, lemon, orange, pistachio, pomegranates, rice, spinach, and watermelon. Today, those are all still very intimately a part of the Sicilian cuisine, and some of them are even major exports today. So a part of the population continued to speak Arabic until the mid-13th century, and there are several remnants in the Sicilian dialects that do come still from this period. So, for example, azizari means something that is very precious or beloved. Gebbia is a pool or a small body of water, and that comes from the Arabic word that means a well. Miskina, same thing as in Arabic, poor one, poor you, poor guy. Raisi, which means something similar to leader. Then zagara, very similar as well to the Arabic, which means a blossom or a flower even. And then a lot of town names in Sicily as well were influenced by Arabic. So we see Mongibello, Gibelmana, Gibeldina comes from the Arabic jebel, meaning mountain. Or Calta Girona, Calta Nisetta, Calta Belotta, Calta Vutura, which comes from the Arabic word qala, which means castle. So also Mizilmeri, Minzil al-Amir. Mizilmeri was a town where there was a fight between, or a battle between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Empire. And apparently, it was between the Normans, sorry. It was between the Normans and the Islamic Caliphate, and the Islamic Caliphate lost, and apparently this is the resting place, the final tomb of the prince, because Minzil al-Amir means resting place of the prince. So then the qanat, these were basically channels that ran underneath the city, developed by the Caliphate, and then further developed by the Normans, and several were still in use even up until the 16th century. We can see a few today, but they're really not in use. But here's just another example of Arab engineering being brought into the city. So another way that we can think about how to contextualize how many Muslims or how powerful was the Islamic dynasty at the time is if we think about how many mosques were in the city. So in the capital city, there were more than 300 mosques. One of which was the Grand Mosque of Palermo. It was later transformed and expanded into the Cathedral of Palermo, and today only one column with an inscription in Arabic remains to signify what was once a mosque on this site. So that's what we can see here. We have here's the image, and this was a small inscription that is most likely it's up top here on one of the columns. And it's actually, it's a part of the Quran. It's from Surah 7. And in my opinion, I don't know for sure, but in my opinion, one of the reasons why this was preserved out of everything in the mosque is because what is stated here in this surah is something that's very similar to what we might see in Genesis. So it's in the Bible. So it's talking about a period or the creation of the earth. And so, I don't know why this was preserved as opposed to others. Who knows what the other things were there in the mosque? But I think that maybe this is why this was chosen. So the architecture that I'll show you during this presentation does not come directly from the period of Islamic rule. In fact, it comes right after, during Norman period, and represents a continuation of Islamic engineering advancements and artistic style. So, the Normans eventually conquered the island, and the Norman kingdom actually came from northern France. At the time, they were already in parts of southern Italy. And in the second half of the 11th century, the Normans invaded Sicily, captured Palermo by 1072, and it was all completed by 1091. In Sicily, the Arab Muslim population continued to exist for a time, but in the end, they were wiped out by either conversion or expulsion. However, Muslim social position was actually quite precarious, and they heavily depended on governmental protection during the time of the Normans. So for this reason, the Muslims that were in Sicily during the Norman period were on the island because of their high value to the government's agenda. Sometimes they retained their family's high-ranking status in the government, so they were highly skilled and helped maintain the Norman kingdom, or they had highly desirable skills in engineering, architecture, craftsmanship that aided in the Normans' expansive building projects. And that's what we'll take a look at now. So, the first piece is the Cathedral of Monreale. Monreale is a town that was eventually built up around the cathedral. The cathedral and the town now are about 30 minutes outside of the city. Of course, that wasn't the case at the time. But the establishment of the cathedral complex, because it's more than just a cathedral, it's also some other buildings that form a whole complex, but we're just going to take a look at the cathedral. So this building project was critical to establishing the new government of Sicily. The Normans enacted the power of religion and monumental architecture to serve as a symbol of a distinct new Christian European era of the island. This establishment also provided closer oversight, conversion, and ultimate assimilation of the Muslim population. Though the Normans did not immediately want to erase the Islamic identity. In fact, in Norman building projects, they proposed a fusion of Western Latin, Byzantine, and Arab Islamic visual and engineering traditions. In the drawing from these previous traditions, the ruler, William II, was also looking to assert Sicily as the heir of these traditions. In William II's eyes, Monreale was set to compete for grandeur and prestige with the greatest imperial building projects of the time. More specifically, you might know about these two, the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran in Rome and the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. So he really saw himself as moving the capital away from Rome, away from the East, and now headquartering the place of Christian European land to be Sicily. Now, the Normans, in order to do this, employed craftsmen from all over the Mediterranean on their building projects. Craftsmen that were already on the island, and then others that got brought in. They constituted Greeks, Arabs, Venetians, Berbers, Provençals, really from the whole Mediterranean world. The Arab craftsmen, so we know specifically a few things that the Arabs, and to what extent the Berbers were involved in building in the Cathedral of Monreale. So, for example, we know that the Arab craftsmen worked on the apses of the church. So this is the apse, it's an architectural term. Basically, the priest would stand here, and then what is behind the priest is what's called the apse, what frames that part of the cathedral. So we particularly know this because of these styles of arches. That's one thing. It was an advancement or a technique used by used by Arab architects is this, what's called an ogive arch. Now, an ogive is a shape. It's used to describe many different things, from anything from a submarine and to this arch. And the word actually derives from al-jub, which is an Arabic word that means a well. And I propose, I think, that the reason why it's called, or it's coming from al-jub, is because a well gets dug in this way. Why? To separate the mud from the water, so that the water rises, and in this shape, you're able to get water, fresh water. Anyway, and so that's where this word from this shape comes. So anyway, Arabs, they were working on the arches. So arches of the apse, arches of the presbytery. Then also the wooden ceiling here. So this here is the ceiling. It's made out of wood, obviously. And this style here so this style is typically Romanesque. So it's the style itself is coming mostly from a European tradition, but particularly when we look at the decorations on the wood, we really start to see, I think one could argue, the Berber influence, if not a broader North African influence. Also, when we look up here, these are what are called coffers, and this style is very particularly North African, if not, again, solidly Berber. But the decorations are very, very similar to what we would see in this part of the world. Next is mosaics. Of course, Arab craftsmen were definitely involved in the mosaic design. All throughout the cathedral, we see on the floor, on the sides here, really unique, intricate patterns of mosaics. Then also on the external apses, so this is what is on the other side of this. So here again we see a very similar intricate use of arches and patterns on the outside. So the next piece that we'll take a look at is today what is called La Zisa. So La Zisa is within the bounds of Palermo. The name comes from the Arabic word meaning the dear one, al-aziz. It was originally commissioned as the summer palace for the Norman kings, the same Norman kings that commissioned Monreale. And this was to serve as the palace on their hunting grounds. These were the same kings that began the building project on the cathedral. The palace is designed internally with an Islamic style. So maybe from the outside it's a little difficult to see. I included this picture because you can see the landscaping that surrounded the whole palace, we'll get to that in a second. So on the inside, things start to become a little more clear. We see the muqarranas, or muqarranasat, is the plural. So here, these little niches, there are 3 of them, 1, 2, 3, and they all form this vault, which is very reminiscent of Arab architecture, and something that we might even see in a mosque. Then, what is most influenced by Islamic engineering is the air conditioning system of the palace. So first, if we take a look at the outside, we can tell that there are fountains that run from the outside directly on inside, and that's what these are. So this is a continuation of the outside fountains that run in, and then they come up here. And these fountains, what they really did is make sure that there was fresh water and fresh air running throughout the whole system and contributing to the whole airflow system of the building. So, but first, there were thick walls, small windows that helped keep that internal stable temperature. Then the castle faces northeast so that the arches would allow for the flow of the temperate winds coming from the sea and the large pools in front of the building. all connect to the main hall's interior and provide fresh air, a flow of air, these sorts of things. Then in the remaining upper levels, they also feature a system of vent ducts that are connected to the lower vestibule in order to create, again, constant airflow. I've been in this building in the summer, and it still works. The next piece does not come from Norman rule. It's actually, we have to skip about 5 centuries to a period in Sicilian history that actually was still, a period of Sicilian history that was actually still witnessing the flow of trade with the Islamic world, even though they were no longer ruled by the Normans or the Islamic Caliphate. So we jump ahead to the 17th, 18th centuries, and this is a room that was only fully discovered in 2013, and it still belongs to the private residence. So it has been proposed, here we'll switch to some other photos. So it's been proposed that this residence belonged to a North African nobleman or merchant during the 17th or 18th century. The owner basically had a mosque built in his house. Now, to what degree this is the case, who the owner is, what was the purpose of this room, it's up for speculation. There are clear indications that support that this was a private mosque. So first of all, the room has eastern exposure. The walls are of an identical size, 3.5 meters by 3.5 meters. It has doors located in such a way to prevent furniture, and the ceiling has a repeating lamp pattern. We constantly see this use of 7. So there are 7 of these lamp patterns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then also that repeats on all 4 walls, as well as here we see there are inscriptions that again follow a pattern of 7. And 7 is a very important number in Islam. So the script that we see, while some of it might be decipherable to native Arabic speakers, most of it's not. And the reason for this, again, is up for debate, but the words are actually a mixture of Arabic, Syriac, and Hebrew, which we don't really know why. So one possibility is that the inscriptions are, first of all, these kinds of inscriptions are popular in Sicily. They're very common for this time, and this kind of manipulation of Arabic script for decorative purposes is popular, though. And there's even a specific category for this coming out of Sicily. It's called Arabisco. And Arabisco is an entirely Sicilian legacy of making Arabic-like script into decorations. And the Sicilian artisan who did this, obviously, probably didn't know Arabic, and mistook calligraphic designs for decoration and emulated them to a very high degree. But even during this time, this kind of Arabisco work wasn't just used in private homes or very expensive commissions. You could find it even on carts that were going throughout the street in order to decorate little carts or small buildings or kiosks. So whether this belonged to someone who was a Muslim or someone who was a native Arabic speaker, unfortunately, the material that I found, it's not there. There's a lot of scholars who have gone there, but there's only a few newspaper articles that mention this site. But I think it's valuable nonetheless to kind of, percolate the idea. So anyway, the next section, part 2, we'll have to switch to another location along the Mediterranean. Venice, or as it's called in Arabic, البندقية, was a wealthy, independent, republican city-state that heavily depended on the Islamic world. The city's name in Arabic derives from the Venetians' activities as arms dealers, and it's said that they were the first ones to introduce Arabs to firearms. So Venice initially had a very strong political tie and advantageous trade relationships with the Byzantine Empire, just like Sicily. And as the empire gradually gave way to the Islamic caliphates from the 8th century onward, meeting its ultimate demise in the mid-15th century, so the Byzantine Empire was still trading with Venice up until the 15th century, but the Ottomans finally conquered Istanbul, the capital city, in the mid-15th century. So then the Venetians had to trade with the Ottoman Empire. And this means that they increasingly came into contact with the Muslims and their technology, culture, aesthetics. The principal trading partners of the Islamic world remained the Ottomans, as well as the Mamluks of Egypt and Syria, and also the Safavids in Persia. Venice was Christian Europe's most important interface with the Muslim civilizations of the Near East. This means that the same ships that carried spices, cotton, wheat, industrial supplies to the ports of Venice also brought with them luxurious carpets, velvets, silks, glass, illustrated manuscripts, inlaid metalwork, and even parade armor. Not surprisingly, these and other portable works of Islamic art, which were often superior in quality to what was available in Europe, made an impact upon artistic taste and production in Venice. So, to give a further example of how the contact punctured Italian culture, here are a few words in Italian that derive from Arabic. So first, we have ammiraglio, which comes from the Arabic word meaning amir, comes from the Arabic word meaning prince, which is amir. Then cottone, cotton. Facchino comes from the Arabic word meaning kind of the learned one, or the wise one. Gelsomino is jasmine. Then we have lacca. Lacca is lacquer. So lacquer you would place on a lot of the woodwork or furniture that was coming in. Tazza, which tazza in Arabic I think now means goblet, but tazza in Italian means like a teacup or a mug. Zafferano, saffron, and zenzero, which comes from the Arabic word zenjibil, which is ginger. So, of course, also moving on, just to give another example of kind of this relationship that Venice had, for better or for worse, with the Near East. Of course, they had a codependent, long-standing relationship, but it wasn't always very peaceful. To give a few more examples, St. Mark's body was stolen in the 9th century from Alexandria. St. Mark used to be the patriarch in Alexandria, but in 828 CE, relics believed to be his body were stolen. At the time, Alexandria was controlled by the Abbasid Caliphate, and two Venetian merchants came up with a plot and stole his body. And today we see a mosaic in St. Mark's Basilica depicting these sailors covering the relics with a layer of pork to hinder the guards from inspecting the ship's cargo too closely. So here in the Basilica of St. Mark, that incident is depicted. And so because his body was brought to Venice, that is kind of what consecrated the cathedral or basilica. Then another piece is, the next two pieces were actually both looted during the Fourth Crusade sack of Constantinople in 1204. The Venetians backed the Fourth Crusade due to their special interest with gaining control of Jerusalem. These 4 copper horse sculptures, right here, were on display at the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome in Constantinople was kind of like a sports stadium, and they were later placed atop St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Today they remain inside of the basilica for conservation purposes. Then the other piece is a sculpture of 4 Roman emperors dating from around 300 AD. They were taken from the Philadelphion in Constantinople, which is basically the public square. And during the early 4th century, the Roman Emperor Diocletian instituted a tetrarchy, so 4 rulers, for the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire. And even though this only lasted for about a decade, they are a symbol of unity and stability. So you can see why the Venetians would want to bring them back to Venice, kind of as a symbol more than anything else. The material, porphyry, so this purple marble almost that they're made out of, actually comes from Egypt, and porphyry is very rarely used and typically only associated with imperial projects. So since the Middle Ages, the 4 tetrarchs have been fixed to a corner of St. Mark's Basilica. So let's start with this painting. Here is a painting of Sultan Mehmed II, who was the Sultan of Constantinople, or Istanbul, sorry, we've now moved. It's a painting done by Gentile Bellini, and Sultan Mehmed II conquered Istanbul from the Byzantine Empire in 1453. So the change in power did not waver Venice's interest in the region. Rather, they just had to adjust a little bit to work with a new ruler. In a show of diplomatic goodwill, the Venetians sent several artists and architects to help reimagine and build up the city of Istanbul at the Sultan's request. The most exceptional relationship that the Sultan had with Renaissance artists was with Gentile Bellini. As a clause of a peace agreement, Bellini traveled to Istanbul from 1479 to 1481, and in this time produced many portraits of the new Sultan, as well as scribes, janissaries, and other members of the social elite. Mehmed II had an inflated idea of his own empire, in all honesty, but we can see this denoted by the Latin inscription on the painting, Victor Orbis, which means conqueror of the world. But nonetheless, the Venetians needed to accommodate him. So it doesn't matter how worldly he thought he was, he needed to be placated a little bit. And stylistically, in this painting, we can see that Bellini employs a mixture of Islamic decoration, which we can see in the embroidered cloth or the decorations here on the columns, and then at the same time, really bringing in the ancient Greco-Roman tradition in terms of composition. So we see a barrel vault. This is called a barrel vault, this three-quarter view that we see the Sultan in as well. And here are two other smaller drawings. This is a janissary, which was a private military at the service of the Sultan. And here's another woman. And Bellini did many, many drawings during his time there, and here are just a few examples. So the next piece is a piece of velvet. It's just a sample of a larger piece of velvet. So during the Renaissance, velvet textiles were among the most expensive expressions of affluence and social status. The fabric could be seen on religious vestments, clothing of the upper class, or even indoor furniture. This particular piece comes from the Medici family, one of the wealthiest families of Florence, and it's most likely connected to a marriage ceremony, though because these are just pieces of velvet, we're not incredibly sure. The weaving techniques exemplified in this piece do come from Iran or Syria, though within the Italian peninsula, the production of luxurious silks was tightly regulated in order to ensure quality, and the movements of weavers were occasionally even restricted to prevent the loss of skills to rival city-states. So even though maybe the weaving techniques and technology came from Iran or Syria, this is a piece that was most likely produced in Florence itself. And the cities of Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, they all had weavers and craftsmen that worked on creating fabrics and creating velvets, though they didn't want one going to the other city. So this textile is connected to the Medici family. It was most likely made in the city, but it's worth contemplating the inspiration. How did the weaving techniques of Iran and Syria get to Florence? And Florence had no trade relationships with the Islamic world. While Venice was considered a rival city, Tuscan merchants were posted in Venice, and Venetian imports continued to travel throughout the whole Italian peninsula. So I would propose that this pattern, these weaving techniques, came to Florence by means of Venice from Iran and Syria. To further emphasize this possibility, I have a few examples. So here are three artworks that demonstrate a very similar geometric pattern in terms of proportion, angle, the intersections. And during these centuries, Venice had deep trade relationships with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which is where these doors and this panel is coming from, as well as the Ilkhanate Empire of Iran, which is where this mihrab is coming from. And these relationships were unrivaled by any other Italian port city. So if we just take a look back at particularly take a look at those proportions, and if we move on to here, again, if you look up there, in here, if we go back one more time, I think we can see that connection. So the next piece, our final piece, we're almost there. One of the hallmarks of Venetian artistic production was glassware. So beginning in the 13th century, Venice produced enameled glass objects similar to those exported from the Islamic world. The technologies, designs, and raw materials were all derived from the Islamic world. For example, the ash to make the glass was imported from the Ottoman Empire. As we can see with the pilgrim flask, the motifs stray significantly from glassware coming from the Islamic world, as we can see here. So typically in the Islamic world, they would decorate it very well with Arabic calligraphy, but the trope of the pilgrim flask existed since ancient times. The shape, colors, and use of the enamel derived from the Islamic world that we can see here. But the shape itself is associated with a flat-sided vessel that was originally used as a water canteen by travelers during ancient times, so hence the term pilgrim flask. Then it was used throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East during ancient times, this shape, and at the dawn of Islam, it was used in the Mediterranean, further east into Asia for practical purposes, but it was later transformed into an object for decorative purposes, which we see here on the left. However, it was artisans in Syria and Egypt who were the first to perfect the art of applying gilt and enamel decoration to glassware. So although this shape was already there, it was transformed into an object of decoration through, so this process, the paint that's applied, is what's called gilt and enamel. And anyway, in Syria and Egypt is where this gilt and enamel was applied to these objects to make them more decorative. Now, that inspiration is what made its way into Venice. So therefore, this pilgrim flask was not an object for daily use. It was most likely this was most likely a pair. So there were probably two in the series, and they were probably given as a marriage gift. And anyway, again, decorative purposes, not for practical purposes. All right, so we have reached our end. And how can I possibly conclude this? Well, I hope that I've demonstrated the angles of intersection between today's Islamic MENA region and Christian Europe and how they really truly abound. I would also like to challenge the definition of what is considered Islamic and why one object is considered Islamic as opposed to another. Is an object Islamic due to its ability to invoke spirituality? This is a topic that I've really avoided discussing here. Or is it because it comes out of a territory that was ruled by Islamic style of governance? Or is it Islamic because it recalls the technological advancements that arose from an Islamic society? I think we see here, through these examples, through these two parts, something that touches on all of these questions, but I'll have to leave them with you. And thank you for your time and attention.